When a talented musician dies suddenly at a young age, we're left with an intimate and potent reminder that can bring them back to us on demand. It's the sound of their voice. In 2020, one of the most promising sons of a new Nashville scene was silenced by an accidental fentanyl overdose. Justin Townes Earle had a famous last name and middle name, but a sound and approach uniquely his own. And it resonated deeply with a New York fan, now biographer, named Jonathan Bernstein.
It was an intense challenge in many ways, but what it really did for me is raise the stakes of what my responsibility felt like as his biographer and as the person with the opportunity to try to tell not only the story of a life, but the story of a really beautiful and complex and sort of in some ways tragic life. I'm telling, what I hope is, if not the definitive, one of the lasting tales of a great artist's life who isn't around to tell that tale himself anymore. And it gave me a real mission and a real sense of importance and really like responsibility to write the book that I think his life and his art deserved.
John spent a lot of time here in Nashville retracing, reevaluating, and respecting the suburban turmoil that fertilized Justin's talent and his troubles. It's all in his very first book, What Do You Do When You're Lonesome? The Authorized Biography of Justin Townes Earle. I'm Demetria Kalodimos. It's Banner & Company. As a writer, writing about someone whose past is tricky. But in some ways, is it safer than writing about someone who's still with us, who could actually read what you put on the page?
It's a great question. It is legally safer.
I bet.
But I think this is my first book, and I don't know what else to compare it to. I've often thought about, what would it be like to write a book about someone who is around and who could be actively, personally participating in their own biography. And I think it would present its own set of challenges and probably its own set of pros and cons. But for me, writing a book about Justin Townes Earle, who not only had passed, but had passed in a really tragic, excruciating way, and had also passed and lived his life in a way such that there was a lot of really like complex grief, not only grief, but like complex grief. He left a real wave of real difficulty in his loved ones' lives.
Here's a little surprise for you. The first musician who ever played in this little space, what we call our theater, was Justin Townes Earle.
Wow. Yeah. I had no idea. When was that?
I'm racking my brain. I'm thinking it might have been around 2011 in association with Americana, because we weren't quite done with our construction. And at the time I was like, I don't know if you want to be in this space. And they were like, no, it's great. It's great. He loves it.
Wow.
And so around the paint buckets and everything else, this room was kind of put together. But his spirit lives in here somewhere.
That's amazing. And I'm so glad that we got to experience in this conversation what I got to experience pretty much every time I came to town for this book to interview folks about Justin. I would come, with scheduled interviews and, people who were bandmates and ex-girlfriends and, musicians. But almost part of my reporting trips to Nashville that sometimes felt the most spiritually important to the project were, going to a bar and telling the bartender that I was writing the book and him having a very strong reaction, having once served Justin Townes Earle, or just everyone having a Justin story in this community. It really gave me, in a beautiful way, like a sense of how strong, how small of a town it is in some ways.
True.
And how close-knit and tight and sort of like loyal his community of people who were born and raised here and are still here are. And so there were just countless examples. I have a friend down here who's a colleague at Rolling Stone named Joe Hudak, and I met up with him, I think, on my first trip here. He had just come from getting a fresh haircut. He looked great. And he goes, I was just getting my haircut. I was telling my barber what I was, who I was about to see. And guess who had his haircut by my barber? And I ended up interviewing Justin's barber, and it was a really fascinating and wonderful interview. So just spending, I truthfully...
Well, no one knows you like your hairdresser.
Exactly. Parts of me wish that I could have pulled like the full Robert Caro biographer, method acting move of just moving here fully and just really immersing myself in this place. I know that every second I spend here was so important to this project because just, like I said, so many spaces in this city, the ones that haven't been knocked down in the last 10, 15 years, have some trace of his spirit in it.
Let's start with a special place. The Chicken Shack, and I don't mean a hot chicken stand somewhere. We are talking about the backyard of Kevin Welch, right?
Yes. Very early on, it became clear to me that this physical space, which I'll describe, was not only key to understanding Justin and his artistic story, but a pretty important physical space in the history, frankly, of Nashville roots music and of roots music just in the 21st century. Kevin's son, Dustin Welch, who's a wonderful musician, basically moved back into the Chicken Shack, which is, kind of just like in some ways, your average suburban garage shed space where teenagers hang because there are no parents there. Dustin took it a step further and just actually lived back there as a teenager. This is in the late 90s. I think 1998 he moves back there. He's like 17 years old or so. And he starts amassing, his dad's recording equipment, musical instruments, a couch, a fridge for beer, a TV so they can screen movies. And pretty quickly, within a few years, in the late 90s and early 2000s, there's a whole community of his friends and his friends' friends. A lot of them went to Hillsborough High School and graduated in the late 90s, who are like either about to graduate high school or have just graduated, but crucially are not 21 yet. So they're not supposed to be in bars.
But they're in someone's backyard. It's pretty safe.
It's pretty safe. Dustin's mom, Jen, who I interviewed, she was almost always in the house. If anything crazy happened, she could intervene and could be there. And these people, which range from, of course, Justin Townes Earle, who eventually shows up, to their bandmates in a band that they all formed together called the Swindlers, a number of musicians who all have prominent, in some ways, fathers in Nashville. Corey Ounce, Skylar Wilson, Travis Nicholson, the sons of Gary Nicholson, Wally Wilson, and Bobby Ounce, and many others, start making music back there, start obsessing over their father's blues records. As one person put it to me, they would be... they'd put their fingers on the record to slow it down so they could study the banjo parts.
Wow.
Just truly just immersing themselves in art and music and old American music.
Are these guys collaborative or competitive?
I think both. They're teenagers. They're varying egos. I think in the beginning it started very collaborative, very innocent, very sort of like pre or non-professional. Like they are boys hanging out. And they don't know where to go on Friday nights. And they're walking down to the Bluebird, which is nearby whenever they can. Several of them are working at the Bluebird in various roles. It's almost like a real-life version of the fantasy life in ABC's Nashville or something. Everyone's working at the Bluebird. And it starts off very sort of non-competitive and just almost educational, And eventually the Swindlers... become something of a really real band in Nashville. They start playing gigs. They start going down to Springwater. They start playing all around town and getting attention. And all the while, musicians start flocking to the Chicken Shack. Jason Isbell stops by. Perhaps Kesha, I've heard, might have stopped by.
That's
Nashville.
possible in that era. Yeah.
Malcolm Holcomb, starts
R.I.P.
going by. All of these beautiful musicians start, the guys on Old Crow Medicine Show who are very close and part of that scene pop in. And it really, when I first started hearing about this space as someone who like had been covering and just was a huge fan of music coming out of Nashville and let's say 21st century Americana roots music, I'd never heard of it. And I got so excited at the chance of telling the story of the Chicken Shack and letting it, sort of shine as this kind of like beautiful space of, kind of innocent exploration and kind of forming of artistic identity. And it's my belief that place, though Justin never talked about the Chicken Shack, he was quick to sort of like, exaggerate his own singular great man story. It became very clear to me it was an incredibly formative place for him as an artist and as a person.
Are there photos of the shack?
There are photos of the shack. They are in my book. I put a few in my book, which I needed to do because the way people talked about this place, this isn't like a place you can Google. Immediately my first impulse when people started telling me about all these formative musicians, I was like, oh, someone must have written about the Chicken Shack. You Google, it's not on the internet. There was a small part of me that almost didn't quite believe it was a place that existed in the way it was being spoken about in almost mythical terms. I remember one person who just like hung out there, she said, when I think of that place, I just remember it glowing, which really stuck with me. And it was when I found, it was not until I saw photos of all the junk and art and, dream catchers and just stuff that occupied this very crowded little space that I was fully convinced it was real.
So you said the guys, well, Justin Townes Earle included, were studying records and other things, but certainly he had to have some sort of a formal teacher, or could a person learn guitar to the degree that he learned it on his own? Or was his dad teaching him?
I think it was a lot of, I think Justin, I would describe Justin in like, if I had to describe him in one sentence, I would describe him as self-taught. That being said, he was someone who was self-taught, who had every resource and musical genius in his orbit, at his disposal. A lot of people really point actually not only to his dad, but to his aunt Stacey Earle as being like a really formative influence on his guitar style. The late, great Malcolm Holcomb was a huge influence on Justin's guitar playing in particular. And honestly, like many members of the Swindlers, many of these musicians in Nashville in the late 90s who had the kind of cultural resources of having their father in the music industry, Justin had access to his dad's immersive and expansive record collection, VHS collection of old documentaries about bluesmen like Lightnin' Hopkins and Mance Lipscomb, both of whom were formative influences on Justin. So I would say he was self-taught, but, again, someone who had every predisposition and sort of access to art and music to help him teach himself.
Is it true that he was really into soccer as a young man and considered that maybe a path?
He loved soccer. He loved basketball, but apparently soccer was his big sport that he was best at. He claimed in interviews that he was like on the path towards going almost, semi-pro, and that I would say for me as his biographer fell into the very large category of unconfirmable, perhaps exaggerated stories that he told about himself. But he was very tall from a young age, and I think was pretty talented at soccer in sort of like middle school age. And again, he claims that I think he had some sort of injury that shelved his career, but I'm not sure how true that is in a literal sense.
So we're talking about these young sons of notables. How many of them were experimenting with substance and getting into problems?
Yeah, Justin, from a young age, the short answer is many or most, if not all of them, but to very varying degrees. Justin grew up, a lot of the friends that he found from a young age in his adolescence, even before the Swindlers, are also just teenagers growing up in sort of Hillsborough and just sort of like middle-class neighborhoods in Nashville who, some of them had parents in the music industry, not all of them. A lot of them grew up in, like non-conventional families. One parent there more than the other, parents struggling in various ways. And a lot of them, Justin from a young age got into very typical teenage trouble. He was skateboarding around town and, trying to make homemade napalm and lighting things on fire, and certainly starting to drink, 40s and, alcohol at a very young age, getting into cocaine at a very young age, like mid-teens. And, the scene at the chicken shack, there was, I think a lot of beer, a lot of weed, a lot of very like normal teenage experimentation with substance use with definitely a legitimate side dose of like, maybe one level up from that. Justin was someone who, before he ever touched any substances, had real issues as a kid with impulse control and a real desire to push and test every boundary placed in front of him. I'm talking from, almost like a pre-K type age.
Really?
And he adapted that very quick. I remember his stepmom, the late Lou Ann Gill, who passed away recently, but was a really important source in this book. Remember her telling me a story of Justin, maybe 5 years old, like insisting on trying this really hot sauce as a kid and just wanting to push that border. And he started doing that with substances as a teenager. He took things a lot further than all of his friends and bandmates. He scared a lot of them. He also brought some of them along with him, So some of the members of the Swindlers had real hard lines and boundaries separating themselves from Justin, and that was certainly part of the separation of the group at large. And some of them followed Justin down that road and led them to some pretty crazy places and spaces and experiences in their young 20s.
It's Banner and Company. I'm Demetria Kalodimos. We'll be right back. When we launched Banner and Company more than a year ago, we wanted to help you get to know your Nashville neighbors. One of the best ways to know a neighborhood is to tap into the experience of a realtor or two who really know the city and the region. Richard Courtney and Lisa Peebles are a pair to draw to, as they say. Kind of like matchmakers, they have the experience and relationships to connect you with people and homes that best serve your personality and your lifestyle. And with more than $1 billion sold, you can bet you'll be in good company. To connect with Richard Courtney and Lisa Peebles, visit NashvilleLuxuryEstates.com. Was it inevitable that he would leave Nashville at some point? He had sort of a love-hate relationship with his hometown.
That's a great question. I think Justin needed to leave Nashville, literally, if not spiritually, for a little bit of time in order to, Justin took himself very seriously as an artist, and he wanted to be taken very seriously.
Well, doesn't that happen when you're in the shadow of a famous father?
Absolutely. I think there was a huge need for him to prove not only himself as an artist and as an individual, but prove himself as someone that can stand entirely separate from his father, and not to mention his middle namesake, Townes Van Zandt.
Right.
So I think, Justin, his first real time away from Nashville, he goes to Chicago for a few months as an 18-year-old, but he moves to New York very loudly and proudly in his mid to late 20s. And for him, I think it was a way to almost show the world and show himself that he was, going to try to be a great American artist in some ways. He narrated his move to New York in these very grand mythic terms. He was chasing Woody Guthrie's ghost down the New Jersey Turnpike, is what he said at one point. Just sort of absurd, wonderfully grandiose sort of self-narration of his own life. Of course, Bob Dylan had made the same move from the Midwest 50 years prior. People weren't really doing that in the same kind of dramatic way in 2008, but Justin did, and Justin never said this, but Justin moves to New York about 3 years after his father moves to New York, very vocally, and so I think that was part of it, though that is certainly not how he dictated his move to New York. But Justin a deep love-hate relationship with his city. He was mostly so proud of being from Nashville and being like a born and raised Nashvilleian. But I think, almost part of that story for himself had to involve him going away and kind of getting that perspective on your hometown that sometimes you can only get when you create distance from it, even if it's only temporary.
Can you hear it in his music? Can you hear the growth and the changes?
I think so. I mean, I think, it's almost easy to laugh about Justin making this grandiose move to New York, but then again, he records and writes and is inspired by New York on his most well-known album, Harlem River Blues, which, the geography and the sights and smells and sounds of New York City are everywhere on that record. And you kind of hear that record, it gets referred to and thought of as his New York album because there are songs about the subway and about the Harlem River on it. The interesting thing about that album is that he flies back to Nashville to record it with the musicians here that he knows and trusts, and with the sounds and the spaces in the studio House of David that he knows and trusts. So in many ways, that record is also a reflection of kind of like what he has taken from and now sees in Nashville by way of New York or something like that.
Yeah. You touched on it a little bit, these outlaw, renegade, kind of free spirit musicians always tell so many tales. What percentage of those turned out to be fact-checkable?
Yeah, I mean, my day job is that I work as a fact checker at Rolling Stone, and I would joke with almost everybody I interviewed for this book that like 10 years as a fact checker was my great preparation for trying to write the story of Justin Townes Earle's life. Justin told so many tall tales. He got it from his father in many ways. Both Steve and Justin Earle believe deeply in the motto that you should never let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Well, they're writers.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. They're writers and they're storytellers, and they're great writers and great storytellers. For me, it was interesting to. Oftentimes, I went into many of Justin's tall tales with the assumption that he's just totally bullshitting or totally full of shit. And what was so kind of both fun and really kind of, I think, where I found a lot of meaning in my project were finding those grains of truth, which almost always existed. Oftentimes the stories were way more true than I thought they would be.
Really?
And kind of finding, where I think and hope a lot of meaning in Justin's life may shine through in this book, or at least it's my hope that it does, is kind of in that space between the story Justin tells, the true, less interesting story. So, one example is Justin talked as an adult about how he had been incarcerated as a middle schooler. And that from day one sounded like not true to me. I don't think Justin, had a prison stint as a 15-year-old. That's not even really how that works. And what I came to find out is that was his way of talking about a period of time that he spent involuntarily at a troubled teen wilderness camp in the middle of the Tennessee woods.
Like an outward bound kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That his father had sent him to after Justin stole his father's gun as a 14-year-old and wouldn't tell him where it is, and put Steve in a very scary position, had to send his kid away, which I'm sure was not easy for his father. So to learn that Justin, narrated these months that he had sort of shivering by himself in the woods, probably afraid in some ways, alone, to me, that was very telling of, maybe what the emotional truth of what that time was for him, to learn that he had, he would go on to sort of, in the troubadour style, tell people that he had been locked up. So there was a million instances of that. And it was, I tried to both, tell the truth in this book because I'm a journalist, and also let Justin's, fanciful and kind of beautiful telling of his own life give it oxygen and show readers kind of where those things interacted, rather than merely being a scold and wagging my finger every time I realized he was lying, which was often.
It seems to me that he had a pretty close relationship with his mom, who chiefly raised him, and then a happy marriage, right?
Yes.
A faithful marriage?
He was very close to his mom. He was very protective of his mom as well, and he talked about her in a very specific way. I think he tended to as I read in the book, he tended to sort of portray his mom as hero, father as villain. Though I think the truth was much more complicated. I think that though he loved his mom and his mom loves him very deeply, their relationship was much more complex than how he portrayed it in the press and in public. And he was very happily and stably married for a number of years to his wife, Jen Marie Earle, who is his widow and the mother of his child. But that marriage became very difficult. Justin, in the last few years of his life, really started sort of a multi-year kind of tailspin and relapse back into substance use. And during that period, he sort of cut ties and alienated just about everyone in his life, chiefly among them his wife. And so it was really hard to confront that and to tell that part of the story. I did not have fun telling that part of the story.
I'm sure.
But it was representative of, frankly, what happened with a lot of Justin's relationships in his life, whether they were musical, platonic, familial, romantic. He had very close, very intense relationships that tended to get cast aside after a certain period of time.
Didn't he sort of famously say, I'm an addict, but I can never guarantee that I won't slip back? I mean, that's brutal honesty, but also that is a red flag screaming out there.
Yes, you're right. Justin struggled on and off with substance use his whole life, I would say starting at age, 12 to his death, really. I mean, that's the honest truth of it. There was a real period of public sobriety, of sustained, unabashed sobriety in Justin's life, and that became his public image when he started becoming a nationally known artist, because it coincided with that time. He was completely sober when he released, Yuma, his first EP. And because that was his image, when his first sort of relapse became public, which kind of culminated in this altercation and arrest outside a club in Indianapolis in 2010, Justin really had to contend with how his image was being shaped and changed and shifted around him. And I think there was a part of him who realized he was no longer in control of that image, that he really wanted to, and it was very meaningful and important to him to show the world that he had become a sober man who had grown up and learned his lessons and things like that. And so when that image changed, Justin was always very brutally honest and forthcoming about his challenges. And you're exactly right. From the minute he starts getting interviewed and being forced to talk about his sobriety, he tells everyone, back in 2011, like, hey, I just went to rehab and I'm sober today.
No guarantees.
No guarantees, yeah. Which in some ways you have to really appreciate the honesty of that.
And I know you have his widow's blessing and support on this project. Did she regret allowing him to have his space, his artistic space, which could, create great songs and great music, but also could be a place where he ultimately passes away, right?
I think Jen Marie Earle, Justin's widow, loved Justin so deeply. She remained so committed to trying to be there for him, even when what that looked like felt impossible, and she had, frankly, no idea what to do. I think what she has expressed to me is that she has learned so much, since his passing, but even just after the fact, while they were still together, about addiction, about substance use, about mental health, about what ways, you can show up for someone in the throes of these things that she says she wished she had known, or when back in the day, she wished, when they first met, Justin, they first met in 2013 and very quickly got married. And Justin, like he showed the rest of the world, showed to her a man who was completely well and who was completely past his demons. And she believed him. She was falling in love with this man, and he was in a relatively good place. But as she said to me, she wished she had better understood that at the time he was still, just because he had been sober that day or that month, he was still struggling. So she's like any human being trying to support someone who you both love deeply and who is both hurting you and hurting everyone around him, and seemingly incapable of helping themselves. She just sort of tried everything and threw everything at the wall. And
sure.
Yeah.
And believed
Exactly.
in him. Yeah.
Believed in him, trusted him until certain things happened, and had so much faith in him and in them. And yeah, it was really really hard to learn about, even when it came to a wife and a daughter that he loved so much, how Justin found ways to self-isolate.
It's Banner and Company, and my guest is Jonathan Bernstein, the author of a new biography on Justin Townes Earle. We'll be right back. Is he an artist in your mind who will be growing more important with time?
I truly think so. I truly think that Justin's body of work is such that, he will become an artist that we think of as someone who didn't get their fair due, or was ahead of their time, or was almost an under-acknowledged influence on so much contemporary music. And I truly think that his songs are going to be heard decades from now, and perhaps appreciated more decades from now than they are now. And I think it's sort of, I think it started to happen pretty quickly. I remember shortly after I started writing this book, I went to go see this artist, Charlie Crockett, who's enormously popular, Texas songwriter type of guy who you think might be influenced by Justin. And I'm standing at a club in New York. Halfway through the show, he starts playing Harlem River Blues. And I had no idea that was happening. And I think moments like that keep happening, and I think are only going to really continue to happen.
Yeah. Your book goes out, obviously, to a lot of people that already know the story and just want to dig deeper. But what about the people who have never heard about this young man? Why should they pick up the book, musician or not?
Yeah, I hope that this book, for those, for those, who aren't Justin Townes Earle super fans, Justin's story is one of, it's a story of redemption. It's a story of forgiveness. It's a story of fathers and sons. It's a story of anybody who really is trying to make it in the world, somewhat in the shadow of a parent or of a figure who raised them, that they feel both so much connection to and debt to, but also so much of a need to establish their own path, their own self. We call them Nepo babies now.
Right.
But Justin's sort of, I hope that a lot of people who can recognize that in that story. I think this is also, of course, a story about addiction. It's a story about sobriety that doesn't end well. But Justin's commitment to sobriety, his belief in it, though he was not able to achieve that in a long-term sustained way for himself, is a hard story. It's not it's a heartbreaking one. But what I hope people take away from this book, especially those who, again, aren't just looking to get the facts about their favorite Justin albums, is that Justin, despite everything that was every card that was sort of stacked in the deck against him, whether that be genetics or his upbringing or his parents or all those things, he was able to live such a long, beautiful life. He lived a lot longer than he said he ever, that he talked about having lived
Really?
much longer than he thought he would. And he wrote these songs that connected with so many people, that inspired so many other people to become sober and to, face their mental health struggles in a really meaningful way. And so I do take a lot of beauty and inspiration from what he was able to achieve for himself and accomplish in the life he was able to live in spite of all of those things. And then just, I hope this book is also a story of sort of 21st century roots music, and in some ways of the last 30 years in this city, because you can really kind of map Justin's life onto the last 30 years of Nashville in so many ways. And I had a lot of fun trying to show that in different ways. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind based on where we are sitting right now, and this was such an exciting, almost like every now and then a writer is just handed a metaphor. Justin, when he was in his early 20s, right around 2003, 2004, he was in a pretty difficult and very dark time in his life. And he started spending a lot of time in this place called the Shirley Street Station, which was sort of a music venue, sort of a drug den, sort of a brothel. And it was basically a few blocks from where we are, sort of adjacent to downtown Nashville on Shirley Street. And when I started learning about this place, I kind of couldn't believe that it existed, in part because the street on which it existed had been razed entirely to build the convention center in Nashville just a few years later. And so for me, that was such an exciting metaphorical moment in this book of like this Nashville, the Nashville of Justin's youth, the Nashville of Justin's artistic, formulation. In some cases, you literally cannot even find on a map anymore because the street doesn't exist. It's been bulldozed. And so I hope that this book is also somewhat of a chronicling of the kind of recent past, but very much past in this city's cultural history.
Absolutely. I mean, every Nashvilleian has a story about, I can't believe you're living in that neighborhood. Back when,
Right.
you would have blocked every door and bolted every window before you'd move in there. And now it's the toniest place in town.
And for me, as someone who is not from here, I would read all of Justin's interviews about where he grew up in Hillsborough, Belmont, and in Hillsborough Village.
Edge Hill, yeah.
Edge Hill. He called it South Nashville sometimes. And of course, part of this is Justin's mythologizing to the rest of the world, but he would talk about how rough and tumble it was and how hardcore it was. And I know that there was a lot of
There's truth there.
There's a lot of truth there. And part of what was fun for me was squaring that, of course, with me doing the biographer thing of showing up to Nashville and walking around these parks and seeing all these wonderful little parents with their strollers in the parks where he talked about finding crack needles and stuff like that. So that really, for me, those types of experiences put a fine point on how much has changed, which was something Justin cared about a lot and bemoaned quite a bit. The vanishing of the city of his youth.
Yeah. Before we borrowed area nicknames from y'all in New York,
Right.
before the WeHos and the Sobros
Right.
and all these other hoes. Banner and Company is a production of the New Nashville Banner. This episode is produced by Steve Haruch and edited by me. The original music is by Verlin Thompson. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or go to NashvilleBanner.com. You're in good company. Our final question, Jonathan, is always in the fishbowl.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Amazing.
So it's your choice. We don't have a ton of them today.
I'll take it.
And if you could read aloud, you most likely will not know whoever's posed the question, but no
Okay.
matter.
Great. I'll read it aloud.
Yeah.
From Craig Haverhurst. I do know Craig. He, I know, is a big fan of Justin's. From Craig Haverhurst, if there was an
instrument Hall of Fame, which instrument out of all of them would you nominate?
Just on a personal level, the first thing that comes to mind is the mandolin. I think it adds so much to the type of music that I love. I think it is the most beautiful of instruments. So I think I'd go with the mandolin. That's definitely what comes to mind. I don't have an amazing case to make for the mandolin other than, I think of Levon playing it in his cover of Atlantic City, and I think of, that being the greatest sound I've ever heard.